Last week we started to look at organisational structures. We looked at Erwick's 10 principles and looked in detail at some core components of management and structures, particularly specialisation, span of control, authority and responsibility, and chain of command. We looked at different types of organisational structures, functional, divisional, matrix, simple and learning, and we started to look at classical theories and models. We introduced Max Weber, Frederick Taylor and Henri Fayol. So why is organisational structure and our understanding of the theories supporting organisational structure so important? As we mentioned last week, good organisation structure does not by itself produce good performance, but a poor organisation structure makes good performance impossible, no matter how good the individual managers may be. We looked at 5 consequences of a poorly designed structure: low morale, late and inappropriate decisions, conflict and a lack of coordination, poor responses to new opportunities and external change, and rising costs. Before we get into that, and thank you for the feedback from seminars about some of the aspects of content here, it is clear that I had not taken into account some students' inability to cover or to countenance some of the aspects that I'm covering here in some detail. So I'm taking a little step back to talk a little bit about theory and why we talk about theory, and to talk a little bit about some of the basic concepts and words that I'm using here, which are new to some people. So the first one that I want to consider is this word called theory. We study theories in academic world, theories or models, and my assumption was we would all understand why we're studying theories, but that isn't necessarily the case. It's quite difficult when you're standing in a position like this, addressing students, because there's a variety of understandings of theory and backgrounds in this kind of area. So I'm trying to make this as simple as possible, but I think I've missed a couple of key points. The first one is that theory, and therefore theorists and models, are fundamental to our understanding of the way that we live, our universe, our environment, the way organisations and businesses work in this particular context. If we can understand the basic concepts which people have written about over a long period of time, then we can better understand how things might develop into the future. That's the reason for theory. The reason we look at organisational theories is because it has a significant impact upon our everyday lives, on our careers, on the amount of money that we have available to us in loans from the banks. When one looks at the list of significant business failures over the last few years around the world, particularly but in America and in Europe, there are huge organisations that have gone to the wall due to poor decision making based upon not necessarily poor leadership, but poor organisational structure linked to perhaps poor leadership. So General Motors, once one of the largest companies in the world, MySpace, Napster, the first of the online downloading music systems, Borders, once the largest bookshop retailing chain in America, Betamax, slightly older failure, a competitor to VHS videotapes when they first came out, which went to the wall, Swissair and Pan Am, 2 significantly large airline carriers, Woolworths, one of our best known retail chains, Polaroid, the name itself is the company, and Blockbuster last year or so. All companies and brands that were known to us, all of which have gone to wherever dead businesses go. The consideration here is that people can see, looking at theory and looking at models, the way these companies are likely to go. So in 2010, US News came up with a list of companies that at that time were losing their way. That list included Blockbuster, Dell, the computer company, Eastman Kodak, the camera company, Microsoft, of course we know, Motorola, Sears, Sony, Sun Microsystems, Toys R Us, and Yahoo. So these were all companies highlighted in 2010 as companies losing their way due to, as I mentioned, a combination of structure and leadership. During that time then, since that time and now, Blockbuster, as we know, have gone to the wall. And what I've got here is a table which indicates the share price, the high price of the shares in 2010 and their current price in 2014. So Blockbuster's share price, of course, the value of the company is nil. It's now in liquidation. Dell was identified as being lacking direction. That company was bought out through a management internal buyout in 2013, so is no longer being traded. Eastman Kodak was at a low of 5.61 in 2010 and is now almost valueless. Microsoft was seen to be in danger, but has resurrected its product line and has increased in scale. Motorola has increased in value, but that's because the company was split up in 2011. Sears has gone down by 2/3. Sony has halved in value. Sun Microsystems was purchased in 2010 by another company called Oracle, and Yahoo's share price has gone up, but only because 14% of the workforce was made redundant in 2012. So these are real examples of where the theories and the models which we're discussing weren't being implemented correctly. On the UK side, looking at the high street retail chains, we can see over an 8-year period from 2007 to 2014, 319 companies, well-known high street names, failed, affecting 26,000 stores, which affected nearly 250,000 people in this country. So the ability for leaders and managers, and you will be leaders and managers in the future in your careers, the ability of leaders and managers to take organisations along a progress of success on a long-term basis is always in doubt and questionable. So significant failures then were Comet, JJB Sports, Phones for You, Clinton Cards, Game, Borders, Barrett's, Alexon, TJ Hughes, Jane Norman, Habitat, Focus, The Officers Club, Faith Shoes, Stylo Mosaic, Principles, Sofa Workshop, Allied Carpets. It's quite a horrendous list. MFI, Virgin Megastores. So we mentioned before that the businesses don't fail, it's the leaders who fail the businesses. That's the issue. They have a lack of character or a lack of vision, there's poor branding, there's poor execution of the strategies which have been agreed upon, the strategies themselves may be flawed, there might not be enough money coming into the business as capital, there's a lack of sales, there's a general culture within the organisation which is not positive. So there's a large number of reasons why this mixture of businesses, leadership and organisational structure sometimes don't work out, however strong the company has been historically. So why do we need so many theories? Why do we need so many theories? It's because our language is such that we have lots of nuances in the languages and we can't always agree on the wording that we're using. For instance, when we use the word theory, we use it in a number of contexts. We talk about Einstein's theory of relativity. We talk about attachment disorder theory. We talk about labeling theory. But we also use this word theory in different contexts. So we might say that Harriet says that John isn't interested in her, but my theory is that he's playing hard to get. That's a different use of the same word as theory. In theory this ought to work, but I don't know whether it will work in practice. So there's a distinction there between theory and practice. But these are colloquial uses of the word theory. What we're looking for is something that's a little more thought-driven and considered. We have a couple of definitions here. A basic one then. A definition of a theory. It's a system of ideas which have been described in detail in published form. That's all. So it's a system of ideas. It's just an idea that someone's put forward and has been published. It is testable, it's predictive, but the issue for us in the social sciences, as opposed to in the sciences themselves, the theories that we're dealing with are more likely to be debatable and contested. Wider definitions then. A theory is a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially something based on general principles, independent of the thing to be explained. It's a set of principles on which the practice of an activity is based. So it's an understanding of something is happening, and I have a viewpoint or a theory on why that something is taking place. A theory is an idea used to account for a situation or justify a course of action. So within the idea of the theory, there's also a view of the environment, a view of something that's happening, and perhaps a suggestion as to how that might be predictable into the future. The theories that we use in social sciences need some kind of background. So when we're describing a theory, it's a series of different sets of information and paragraphs. A theory of empowerment, for instance, might read as follows. The difficulties experienced by many people are the result of their oppression by society, which in turn results in making them feel powerless to influence events or to resolve things for themselves. So that's in part a description of a series of events or an activity and a prediction as to what might happen next. Then there's a route through that. Conventional help, for example, medication prescribed by a psychiatrist, may simply confirm their powerlessness and the powerfulness of others. Real change requires that the oppressed take power for themselves or become more aware of the power which they do in fact already possess. So that's an example of a theory. Some people have difficulties with theories because they're descriptions, and in their mind, I think, people think of theories as being kind of equations. But our theories are just descriptions, based upon a viewpoint, based upon an assessment and perhaps a series of experiments with an idea as to what might happen next. Theories in the social sciences are much harder to precisely define, are often contentious and debatable, that's why there are so many theories, and therefore change also over time and vary from one culture to another. So linguistically, people's understandings of the same words might change from culture to culture. Our understanding of the word wedding, for instance, we might have a theory of weddings. The understanding of weddings will change from Europe to Asia or India and Africa. So why do we have so many theories? Well, first of all, because there's so many academics, so many people thinking these things. Secondly, because there's so many instances where these things are happening. There are so many businesses in our context, so many businesses developing, starting and declining. They're useful for us to make sense of things. And because we have individual viewpoints and we have different experiences, we can each come up with different theories. All that happens is that a number of theories are kind of collected around key thinkers. It's the doubt, the changes in semantics, the changes over time, which introduces the rationale for having so many different theories. Another concept that became clear last week during discussions was not everybody was clear as to why we're discussing these things called classical models of organisational theory and contemporary models of organisational theory and neoclassical and so forth. And the answer is basically that's how we think. That's how we group different sets of activities together. So we talk about classical music and contemporary music, classical art and contemporary art. And the same terms are used through architecture, dance, ballet, literature, novels, vocal technique, psychoanalysis, Pilates, liberalism, sociology, piano, social theory, and opera, as a few. We came up with this list because although people are struggling in some instances with the idea that there's a classical view of theory and a contemporary view of theory, it should be generally no difficulty for us to understand that we have this viewpoint that says there were original theories, or that was the first way of doing it, or that's how they used to do it in the old days, but this is how we do it now. We use words like classical and contemporary, but we also use words like traditional and modern. So we have trad jazz and modern jazz. We have traditional homes and modern homes. So we can interchange these two different sets of words, but intrinsically we're all clear, I think, I hope, about the idea that there's one way of doing something that's rooted in the past and one way of doing something that's rooted in what we're doing right now, the contemporary. So let's start to look then at the contemporary view of organisational structures. So going back again to this overarching picture, and instead of looking at the left-hand side now, we're looking more to the right-hand side. Likert, Gardner, Burns and Stalker, and McGregor. We're looking today at leadership and organisations theories. There's a whole series of names which you're trying to contend with, and what I hope to do during the seminars and later on during the lecture series is to highlight some of the key thinkers that you need to be aware of and others that you might like to introduce. And the way that I've split up today's session is that I've split it into two. There's a kind of introductory larger part of all the basic people that you need to know, and then at the end there's some more additional authors that you might like to know. We're going to start then with part one with three key authors. Burns and Stalker, Likert and McGregor. And I want you to keep in the back of your mind that whilst these are contemporary theories of organisational structures, they are rooted and built upon what's happened in the past. And you'll see why I say that when we start to look at particularly Burns and Stalker and Likert, because part of their theory explains Weber. So always have at the back of your mind these three key original thinkers. Max Weber, who came up with the term bureaucracy, Frederick Taylor, who came up with scientific management, and Henri Fayol, who described the management function for the first time. Burns and Stalker then. Burns and Stalker suggested that instead of there being one type of an organisation called a bureaucracy, there are two types of organisations. Now, we know from discussions that we had last week related to Derek Pugh, for instance, that Weber's original idea of there is one type of organisation called a bureaucracy itself has changed into being different versions of bureaucracy. So Derek Pugh came up with the idea that there are three types of bureaucracies. Gardner came up with the idea that there are three different types of bureaucracies, different names. So we already understand that the original concept of bureaucracy has changed over time. Burns and Stalker were one of the first people to describe this modern type of organisation, which they called organismic or organic, and linked it to what they described as mechanistic companies. Now, in general terms, mechanistic companies would be allied to the description of a bureaucracy. So what Burns and Stalker are suggesting is that there are still companies who operate like Weber's ideal bureaucracy, but there is a new type of operation, a new type of company, organic company. One of the details is that these are not either or. The mechanistic company can have versions which are more mechanistic or less mechanistic. The organic company can have versions that are more organic or less organic. But you don't move from a mechanistic company to an organic company without some fundamental structural changes in terms of culture, leadership style and structure. If we know then that mechanistic is a bureaucracy, a bureaucratic type of organisation, then all we need to do is to work out the opposites. So the mechanistic organisation is adapted to relatively stable conditions. And why is that? Well, we know from last week that the bureaucracy has strict hierarchies, rules and processes that everybody is required to adhere to. And one of the limitations of the bureaucracy is that it stifles creativity, it stifles innovation. So therefore, the mechanistic organisation works best when things don't change very much. The organic organisation, which is a newer form of organisation, is ideally suited to less stable conditions because people are working together more as teams. In the bureaucracy, people are working as individuals through a process which is defined by rules and regulations imposed from above. Communication is downwards instructions are moved downwards and reporting goes upwards. In the organic company, there's a completely different form of structure of communication, channeling of information, relationships amongst people. If in our mind's eye, and it's not a great argument, but it's a good one, if in our mind's eye we think of something like in the Inland Revenue, which is a very bureaucratic organisation, or the Passport Office, or anything from the government, and something like Google, we would describe Google as an organic company because they're team-oriented, they work in projects, they work in a matrix, they can deal with changing situations, they come up with new product ranges, new product solutions, they identify customer requirements and change and adapt rapidly. We know how difficult it is for the Passport Office or the Inland Revenue to change. They can't change very well, and therefore there are delays and headlines are hit on a fairly consistent basis as these more rigid structures try to adapt to changing situations. Even if it is, for instance, with regard to the Passport Office, simply a larger number of people requiring passports at a particular moment in time. So Burns and Stalker, mechanistic and organic types of organisations. And it was interesting last week that in the case studies, people started to use this kind of word, mechanistic, to describe an organisation. They also suggested that within this new organic structure, we need to start looking at organisations as social systems. So whilst we might have within the structure a formal authority, within the organisation, people are working for or against the authority based upon their own viewpoints. So we have a formal authority system, a cooperative system of people working together, and then some form of political system. So we find that in some instances there are problems within organisations because however good the brief is, people working within the organisation actually don't want the project to succeed. So Burns and Stalker, one of the key sets of authors of contemporary management theory, looking at the organic structure in contrast to what they described as the mechanistic structure. The second key thinker in this area is Douglas McGregor. He came up with two versions of the same sort of thing, a Theory X company and a Theory Y company. So we have Burns and Stalker talking about mechanistic and organic, similar sort of differentiation. Douglas McGregor, Theory X company and Theory Y. The Theory X company is based upon the premise that the average human being has an inherent dislike of work and will avoid it if possible. So therefore, the management's task is to stress fair day's output, fair day's work, have incentive schemes, to work on methods of enhancing productivity, implementing a system of controls, a system of coercion, all geared around the idea of bureaucracies. So Theory X is another description of a bureaucracy, but introducing Frederick Taylor's idea of scientific management. So the average human prefers to be directed, wishes to avoid responsibility, and has relatively little ambition and wants security above all. That's a Theory X view of a company. So it's a top-down structure, coercion and control, similar to the mechanistic organisation, similar to Weber's bureaucracy. So hopefully you're beginning to get in your mind's eye now, although the fact we were talking about three different authors in this case, they're all talking about much the same thing. Theory Y companies, however, are different. So Theory Y companies assume that people like to work. It's as natural as anything else that we do. We spend 8 hours a day or more working, so why not enjoy it? Why not make as much out of it as we can? People are rational beings. They don't have to be told all the time what to do because they're motivated. They're self-directed, self-controlling and committed to achieving objectives which they've in part agreed upon. Whilst they achieve a salary and pensions and so forth, most people work the theory Y suggests, because they have an innate desire to develop themselves. They like to succeed, they like to achieve, they like to be productive, they like to be part of the social system. Everybody wants to develop themselves. Everybody, the theory suggests, wants to progress, wants to have a career, wants to gain greater prestige and have greater responsibility, and will seek it out when it's not being offered to them. The suggestion then is, if we develop more theory Y companies, so we as human beings will develop better. And the view then for McGregor was that there are still too many old-fashioned theory X companies, and these companies need to progress on to becoming a theory Y company. The third person we want to move on to then is René Likert. All of these authors come along and try and describe from their own experiences at the time that they're having those experiences how they view the world. Likert has come up effectively with a progression of different types of companies which have effectively, we think, progressed over time. The end point for Likert is what's called the System 5 company. And although there are 5 companies, we'll immediately begin to recognise that System 1 to System 2 are bureaucratic type companies. We might describe them as bureaucracies. And we might describe System 3 and 4 as being organic type companies or theory Y companies. So hopefully in your mind's eye again, just to reiterate, although there are these numbers of authors, intrinsically at our level of detail required for this year, for this semester, at our level of detail, they're talking about similar sorts of things. So when you're thinking of an essay, as an example, you can start to list these authors and their thoughts with some ease, with some duplication, without losing marks. Because all you're doing is referencing an ever-increasing wider range of authors. So there are 5 types of companies, Likert suggests. The first type of company is called the Exploitative Authoritative company. So here we've got a company that uses fear and threats. Communication is straight down from the top. Responsibility for all decisions lies with those people at the top of the hierarchy. The superior, the person at the top of the hierarchy, has no trust or confidence in the subordinates, and therefore all communication is downwards, instructions are received downwards, decisions are imposed on subordinates, and all that is required to move upwards is an understanding of, are we meeting our targets? There's very little teamwork. There's a rule and feeling of coercion and authority. System 1, exploitative, authoritative. The assumption always is, of course, that whilst this company, that type of company does exist, and there are situations in which this company can succeed, increasingly nowadays, these companies aren't likely to progress into the future. That's the implicit assumption. The System 2 company, the second type of company, is what's called benevolent authoritative, which is a kind of easing off from this very structured, threat-filled System 1 company. Here, responsibility filters down a little bit, down to the management structure. The subordinates don't feel free to discuss particular aspects about the role. There's very little teamwork and communication, but here motivation is based upon a series of rewards. So the first company, motivation was there because people were told to do the job. The second one is that people are motivated because they're getting some kind of reward for being in the job. So it's still an authoritative structure, still authority being imposed from the top, decisions being forced on people, but slightly more amenable. The third type of company then is what he describes, Likert describes, as a consultative company. Management offers rewards and sometimes punishments. There are better communication, but although there is some upward communication, it's quite tentative at times because no one's quite sure what the response is going to be from the senior people. Responsibility is spread throughout the organisational structure. There's a slightly greater degree of confidence amongst everybody within the organisation, and not only is motivation based upon rewards, so bonuses and salaries and pensions and things like that, but actually people start to get involved in the job. So you can see a gradual increasing lessening of this rigid structure and a more wider teamwork-based organisation. The participative group is team-oriented. There's free communication throughout the organisation. Organisational goals are developed and discussed and achieved as teams. There's a high level of confidence by everybody about everybody in the organisation. There's teamwork, communication and participation. But the point that Likert wanted to get onto was to try and describe this new organisation that he'd come across, this new form of structure that he found at the time very exciting. And he called it a System 4T, or Total Model Organisation. What he was trying to describe is an organisation like Apple, or an organisation like Virgin, or Microsoft. An organisation for the first time where the leader could also be a team member. The leader knew as much about the business as the people at the bottom. They just happened to be the founder. So this new form of organisation, instead of having necessarily a board of directors and a group of people who built the organisation up through a period of time, is geared around one or two people who are very charismatic, who lead the organisation, A, through their skills and experiences, B, because people want to follow them. They're great to work with. If we think of Steve Jobs, or Richard Branson, or Bill Gates, or Zuckerberg, or any of those kind of people, they are enticing people to be around. And the interesting thing about all of those is you know that Steve Jobs started off programming and could program. Even when he was running the organisation, he would still get involved with programming decisions. This was the first time that this new form of organisation, with this leader in place, had been identified. And Likert described it as the total model organisation. The suggestion being that this was the way to work into the future. Okay.